Hello, thank you so much for joining me today. I am going to put together a jacket pattern that was designed by Tatyana over at Tatyana's Doll Designs, and I will put a link down below for that if you want to go check that out. It is a very lovely pattern, as you will see. For those of you who are super excited for the free patterns that were just released by Danny Chu not too long ago, don't worry, those are definitely coming. I had this already done though, and I just needed to edit it, so I wanted to get this out for you to watch in the meantime. There is some stuff that might look kind of familiar from those patterns, so, you know, maybe it'll help. But yeah, I'm pretty excited about this project, so without further ado, here we go. Hello. So, for this project, we are going to try to follow the pattern quite faithfully. We have the sleeve pieces of the outer fabric here. These are the fronts, these are the backs. We've got the collar and the pockets, and on everything that needed one piece to have interfacing, I've already interfaced it. So on the front center and the front side, we've got our interfacing already put on, and now we are going to pin these using the notches to guide how they're pinned. And I have marked the notches. It's extremely hard to see, and I apologize, the lighting is absolute garbage outside, which is making it much harder to light this space. This ended up being a super long video, so I am popping in to tell you that I have cut a lot of the more boring, like, pinning. So just make sure you match up your notches and you should be good to go. And we put that in the machine, making sure to follow our 5 centimeter seam allowance. This is where it really helps to know your machine, because you can find a spot on your machine to make sure that you line your fabric up with, and it really makes things go a lot faster as you go down the line. This is where it helps to go super slow and, you know, rely on those pins when you're connecting two curves together. So I just wanted to show you the difference between ironing seams as you go and if you leave them unironed. Especially with something like this that's interfaced and you're using something heavier, you can see how the left side we've got a nice curved, it looks like cohesively one piece, and then actually not perfect. Let me fix that. Better. So yeah, all kind of one piece. You can tell there's a seam there, but it's pretty subtle unless you're looking for it. Versus this one has not been ironed or trimmed or clipped or anything. And you can see it just looks different. I ended up having a lot to say about that, and most of it was repetitive and boring, so I've gone ahead and cut that out for you. In the meantime, we can watch as I clip those corners. It depends on which direction the curve is going. You want to clip it or just snip it. with more gentle curves like the ones in the sleeves, it doesn't end up being super necessary. But yeah. While I pin this, I completely forgot that I needed to keep the hole open in the back, so I do have to go back and end up fixing that later. But now that we've got everything all nice and ironed, I am pinning the shoulder straps and then showing you what all I'm going to stitch next. So I do go over and put 2 gathering lines on the sleeves, as well as go ahead and sew together my collar piece and the 2 pocket pieces. This is a method for doing super small stuff that Tatyana talks about in most of her patterns, and I love it to actual pieces. I actually use this even if the pattern doesn't call for it now, where you basically pin the piece to the 2 layers of fabric that you're sewing together and then just follow around it, and then you just trim the seam allowance down later. So in this case, you would actually cut the seam allowance off of the pattern piece to do this, except for on the one edge that you don't end up sewing in this way. So you leave the one edge long so that you have that seam allowance later when you need it, and then sew around, and then you trim everything later, and it just makes your life so much easier. And now we pin our sleeves to the jacket, and this is important to keep in mind that these sleeves are directional. You do need that seam to be on the back side, and that is so that the sleeve will curve in the correct direction once it's been put on. Use those gathers to ease the sleeve into the jacket, and you don't want it to actually have puckery gathers. You just want to use that extra to kind of smooth that into the curve, and it makes your life easier to have the gathers there, even though you're not like making a poofy sleeve. I am doing both sleeves at once. I just cut a lot of the footage for the second sleeve because it gets pretty repetitive. And we've done a lot of sleeves on this channel. It's basically the same every time. Just go super, super slow and make sure that things aren't bunching up in unflattering ways underneath. It's hard and it takes a lot of practice, and even now I still get it wrong sometimes, so don't beat yourself up over this part because it is a challenge at this size. Now I am just marking that curved edge for the collar because we want to cut along that, and that does include the seam allowance. And then we're going to cut about 5 millimeters away from the stitching, and then I grade it, which grading a seam like this basically means I cut one shorter than the other one so that when everything is flipped inside out, it's less of a bump to get down to, you know, where there's no seam. And it's just kind of my preferred method for pieces like this. And you will note I did cut the part with facing shorter than the other part, and that's again just to reduce bulk because bulk is the enemy. You will want to make sure that you iron this super flat before you start pinning it, and then find the center of the collar piece and the center of your center back and pin that down. With collars like this, as always, you always want to check that the fronts are even. So your collar isn't going to cover the whole of the front part, and that's normal, but you need that's what I'm doing right here, is just checking to make sure that both sides of the collar end at the same distance from the edge of what's going to become the lapel. And that will just save you a lot of time in the future. Again, to save time in the future, I am actually hand basting this collar in place. I know, you know how much I hate hand stitching, but in this case, I was really glad I did it because it's super useful and it works really well. Look at me struggle. Hoo boy. Well, that's boring to watch, so we're gonna skip. Now we get to repeat it all with the lining, which is, in my case, this slippery polyester material whose only redeeming quality is that my markings show up on it. We'll see how much I regret this. I might switch to cotton, I might not. We'll see. The other difference is going to be you've got your facing and your front. So instead of your front piece being, your front center being all one piece, you have to build it out of these two pieces. If you're wondering why my facing doesn't have interfacing, it's because I only have really, really thick, heavy interfacing, and I didn't think it would be good to double up on that. If you have a normal interfacing, please go ahead and face this piece, or interface your facing piece. This ended up being just a whole lot of pinning, and you can see me here trying to figure out what the front side is of my pieces before I started pinning. But yeah, this is something I kept in because I wanted to point out, you can see that there's kind of a big stretch between the lining piece and the facing, and that's going to come back to haunt me because it turns out there's actually more seam allowance for the facing piece than for the lining piece, and I end up deciding to rip that section where I've stretched it to fit and then make it lay nice and flat, and then I trimmed off the extra seam allowance in the facing and actually on the main fabric. We'll get to that in a bit. I just wanted to point that out because it was something I didn't know how to deal with at the time when I got to it, so I ended up simplifying the finish a little bit. Here you can see me sewing with that really, really awful lining fabric, and just look at it fraying. Oh my goodness. I gave up almost immediately and switched to cotton, and I have no regrets. So now it's time to mark where the little pocket flaps go. I forgot to do this earlier, which is why we're doing it now. What I did was poked a fairly large hole where I want the marking to be, and it is marked on the other side of the pattern piece. Then I line up at least two of the edges as well as I can. This would be much easier to do if I hadn't already sewn this. Stick my pencil in and wiggle it around, and then we've got two very faint dots. And then we do the same on the other side. And now I go ahead and cut out the pocket flap in the same way that I cut the collar piece out. And I grade these seams as well because, as previously stated, that's how I like to do it. These ones I iron very flat, and then I do go ahead and top stitch them. If you want to make this easier, you can also use basically a stabilizer, which can be anything from actual like professional fabric stabilizer to printer paper. I usually used printer paper. However, I have a walking foot, and it makes stuff like this a lot easier to push through the machine because the little foot doesn't drag everything. So I just went ahead and plowed through. These pockets are mock welt pockets. I can't tell you how many times I've tried to say that we're keeping this cut because, oh my goodness. But anyway, to make them look nice, you actually first stitch them on with the pocket facing upwards, and then we're gonna top stitch it, iron it flat, and then top stitch it in the down position. And it ends up making a really nice looking finish. And it's pretty easy to set up and make sure that everything is symmetrical before you do it too, which is really nice. I know people like real pockets, but these are an absolute pain in the butt to make in the proper way so that your doll has a pocket, and I actually prefer this solution so much more. Here you can see I'm doing that top stitching to force it to stay down, and then it just sits properly and it's absolutely lovely. So definitely recommend this method for suit jackets and the like. Alright, so in preparation of connecting the lining and the main jacket piece, we have folded this up along the interfacing, and then we added interfacing, just a 1.5 centimeter strip along the edge of the sleeves and the back on the bottom. And what that's doing is just reinforcing that area without adding a whole lot of bulk to it. So that step where I iron things up actually ended up being a little bit of a moot point because I do end up finishing the bottom slightly differently. I would say it's a good idea to keep the interfacing, but to maybe scooch it about 1/2 centimeter away from the edge and then just leaving it in like that. So something to keep in mind for future projects. In the meantime, we are pinning the collar area with the collar sandwich between it, and then we're pinning all the way down both front sides, and we're gonna stitch that all in one go. I did end up deciding to stitch down the front as well, but I was a little, like I said, we end up changing that a little bit. The other things that I am pinning are the edges of the sleeves and the back. And we are leaving the side seams and the underarm of the sleeves completely open. That will get done at a later step. Of course, make sure you go over that collar area pretty slowly. Even though the collar was basted between them, you're still sewing a lot of different layers together, so it's a good idea to go slow and make sure everything is laying flat as it should. I am trimming all of the sharp corners and putting snips all along the collar edge, which my sad little snipper is getting a little dull, so that was tricky. I ended up getting something a bit beefier to cut through that. Of course, making sure that you are not cutting your stitching line because that will put a hole in it. Now I am turning things right sides out and going along and poking out all the corners. And now I'm noticing that something just isn't right about how this is laying out. my pre-crease wasn't working because of how I had sewn that corner. So I decided to talk to Tatyana about it and discovered that her method for doing this hem was much more akin to what's actually done on human-sized suit jackets. And after waffling about it for a little bit, I ended up deciding to simplify things because, well, it's a doll. It'll be fine. So this is also the part where I realized that the hem allowance, like the seam allowance at the hem, was different for the facing piece and for the lining, and that I had just eased away actually a whole ½ a centimeter that shouldn't have been eased. So you can see me fixing that here, and then I'm going to go and trim the excess seam allowance out of all of the main fabric. After that, I'm gonna stitch all those lines again. I also had to do the same for the back because, again, there was an extra 5 millimeters that needed to come out. After repeating on the other side of the front, I pinned everything back together, and I'm just gonna sew back along those lines. Okay, so after that bit of a trim, these line up much nicer than I had. And this one, to iron this one, I held this seam here and I made sure I was holding the exact same spot on both sides and tugged so that this would pull down a little bit. And this is the way that the original hem had been created. This is how, like, actual human suits work, because you need the lining to be able to move around for humans. It is less of a concern for dolls. So I left the sleeve the way it was. We'll see if I get super confused when I try to sew it together. I might. But you could also change this one the way you change this. Alright, back to quick speed while we figure out how to line up just the lining pieces and just the main pieces with each other while they're all still connected on the end pieces. It's a bit of a puzzle, but if you fiddle with it, you can get there. So, you know, you want the right sides to be pinned to the right sides, you want the lining to be pinned to the lining, and you end up making kind of a silly little shape. That's okay. I found it easiest to start with the ends of the sleeves and pin those first, and then just follow the pieces I wanted. And you can see you've got to kind of figure out where to put other parts to get everything to line up. But once you get it there, it's pretty simple. A little bit more of a puzzle than I'm used to, but it was kind of fun to figure out. I ended up pinning my seam allowance towards the main fabric, and I actually regretted that. I wished I had pinned the seam allowance towards the lining, and I wished I had understitched the lining before doing this step, but live and learn. I'll know that now for next projects. Now on our sewing machine, I do make a point of using my dark thread to sew the dark material and my light thread to sew the light material. That is not 100% necessary. I just strongly prefer it because no matter how good your machine is, sometimes if you pull on the fabric, you can still see the thread. So having your threads match your fabric as closely as possible is a huge bonus. I do have the tendency to just use either white or black thread. There are some colors that doesn't work very good on. These colors, however, like this dark navy blue, it's pretty easy to hide your black in there. So it works out. Most important thing to keep in mind while doing these stitches is to keep your other fabrics out from under what you're currently sewing. I mean, that goes for any project, but for this one especially, it's a little tricky because of the weird shape your piece is in at the moment. Now is our moment of truth. We're gonna turn this right side out somehow. So, through that hole. I picked the lining hole because it seemed like it had a little bit more give. We're gonna take one of the sleeves first. This ended up being a lot simpler than I thought it was. It's speeded up right now, but only by half, where normally when I speed things up, it's by 4 times. And, you know, it's hard to say words about this. Like, you can see what's happening. You very gently ease things through. I started with one sleeve, then I targeted the collar, and then I just had the one sleeve left. And, you know, be gentle, try not to stretch out the hole that you're pulling it through. It is your lining though, and you can fix that later with a little bit of hand stitching, so don't panic if it seems like it's stretching a lot. This is really just, it turned out to be so much less of a thing than I thought it was. So that's good news. Once everything is completely done, I realized one of my sleeves was still kind of inside out, so then I fixed that. Sorry, I got out of frame there for a bit. I was figuring out how to set the extra lining fabric that's in there, and it ended up sitting in there just fine. It just took a little bit of fiddling to get it to lay where I wanted it to and have that hem where it needed to be. I did take a moment to quick pin the lining to the outside fabric around the stand hole just to get that to lay nice while I was trying it on for the next step. And now we've got it tried on. One thing I like to do with lapels is try it on and then set the lapel where I want it to sit while it's being worn in the position it should be. I do pin those in place. And then I go ahead and I iron them good to get as much of a permanent crease in that area as I can. So this is pretty fiddly work. I highly recommend taking your time on this part, both to make sure you don't accidentally stab your doll and also to get those lined up in the most flattering way possible. to take it off the doll, I marked where I want my button or snap to go, and then very, very carefully take it off, making sure not to scratch the doll while I do so. Then I just go over everything and check to make sure I can make the creases the way I want them to be. I didn't film ironing it, but that's pretty straightforward. I did film doing the basting stitches around the stand hole before I decided to sew it. And then you go around the stand hole with, I put the lining thread on top and the darker thread on bottom because I wanted them to match the fabric they were going to be most near. Then you just pull out that basting thread and move on to snaps. I took 8,000 years to decide on what snap I wanted. Seriously, it took me so long, and I have so many different options. I was obsessed for a while with finding the perfect doll-size snaps, and in the end, there is no perfect. There's just what's going to work for which project you're using. I was very torn between the gold and the white. I wish I had white ones in the size of the gold ones, but I do not. So I ended up going with the bigger white ones because I liked how they matched the lining better. And this kind, you just use a little tool, and there you have it. Good to go. You might see she's wearing the skirt. We'll do the skirt in a later video, but for now you have a jacket. And I really love this jacket. It's so nice and professional looking and absolutely fits beautifully. I love that it does have the stand hole, and I think it was so clever to think of turning it inside out through that. I would have never thought of that on my own. I literally had to ask Tatyana how to do it. And there you go. I really love how this jacket turned out, and I was a little worried that the floral would end up looking kind of frumpy, but in the end I think it's pretty cute. I like that it sort of breaks things up a bit, and yeah, I love the fit, as always. So if you like this and you want to see more, go ahead, like and subscribe, and I will see you soon. Bye bye.